Putin's had to deal with the embarrassment of some fairly major incursions into the Russian border area by separatist attackers over the last 24 hours.
Now, Putin is warning the West that Russia is prepared for nuclear war as weapons testing resumes. In a broadcast interview on state television, he said that Russia has surpassed the US in developing modern nuclear arms and made the claim that weapons are there to be used. Let's talk to Lord Richard Dannatt, former head of the British Army. Lord Dannatt, I suppose we need to bear in mind that there is an election of sorts in Russia this weekend.
Yes, you're absolutely right. And not only is there an election of sorts, but Putin's had to deal with the embarrassment of some fairly major incursions into the Russian border area by separatist attackers over the last 24 hours. So he needs to be fairly bullish to try and shore up his standing at home.
That's interesting, isn't it? Because things have changed slightly in the last 24 hours. It did seem for quite some time recently that Russian aggression was paying off in Ukraine, and in fact they were making gains there.
Well, you're right. I think it's fair to say, or sad to say, that the conflict in Ukraine has seesawed one way or another, initially in fairly dramatic ways, but in the last few weeks and months in more modest ways. Sadly, every time there is a movement in the front line, it involves a huge loss of life, both on the Ukrainian side and on the Russian side. But to come back to your main point, this is vintage Putin talking about nuclear weapons and reminding the West, yes, that of course we've got to take Putin very seriously. But I think the issue that has to be analysed is really to think through how likely is he to use nuclear weapons in relation to the war in Ukraine at the present moment. I think it's most unlikely that he would be tempted to use a nuclear weapon outside Ukraine, tempted to use a nuclear weapon on a Western city or some demonstrative use like that. So if there's any credibility to possibly using nuclear weapons, it would be what's called a tactical nuclear weapon somewhere on the battlefield in Ukraine. Now, go back to September, October 2022, when the Ukrainians mounted some pretty successful counterattacks in the Kharkiv and Kherson area. When you had that kind of breakthrough by Ukraine, you could conceive that those were the sort of moments that Putin might have decided to stop the Ukrainian advance with a tactical nuclear weapon. But those circumstances don't pertain now. And I think two other things. The area that they're fighting in are in the four provinces that he, Putin, declared a while ago to be forever Russia. So why would you want to irradiate several square kilometers of forever Russia? And I think the other thing to say is, in the relationship between China and Russia, Russia is very much the junior partner. And I think President Xi has had his hand on Comrade Putin's shoulder more than once to say, look, your war in Ukraine has got us dictators about enough, mate. As it is, don't even think of going nuclear.
Right. But just out of interest, if the worst does happen and he does decide at some point to use a so-called tactical nuclear weapon, what could the response be from the West? I mean, it's hard to imagine, but perhaps we should consider it.
Well, I think the Americans, if a senior American rather than me was talking to you, would probably talk along the lines of strategic ambivalence or strategic ambiguity. There are a range of things that the United States could do. Indeed, there are a range of things that the United Kingdom could do. But I think one thing that one does not do when one's in a deterrent situation is talk in public about what you would do. I think it's reasonable to talk about the sort of things that you could do. And of course, the use of nuclear weapons is one, use of more extreme conventional weapons is another, or targeting other things that are of great value to the other side. For example, the Ukrainians have put the Russian Black Sea Fleet under a lot of pressure. I think if I was a sailor in the Black Sea Russian fleet and there was a thought that my country might use nuclear weapons, I don't think I'd sleep very well in my ship in my bunk at night. You never know what could happen, but there's a range of responses that don't have to all be nuclear that would make President Putin think twice and probably a third time.
Well, that is reassuring. Just really briefly, if you can, Lord Dannatt, is Russia really ahead of the West in terms of nuclear weapons and the development of them, as Putin claims?
That's what he says. Don't take it at face value. I'm not a nuclear expert, and I don't think it would be even if I was, very clever of me on live radio to talk about who was more capable than anybody else. So it's a great question, but I think we'll kick that one down into the West End.
No, it was a relatively good question and a very good answer, can I say. Lord Dannatt, thank you very much for your time this afternoon. We
Richard,
appreciate
thanks.
it. Thank you. This so-called interview that he did was, the interviewer asked him, how does it feel to be a figure of hope for billions of people across the world?
Gosh, well, that's a good question.
Yeah, that's another really good, that's how you ask a question.
And what was his very good answer?
I'm afraid I can't bring that to you, but I suspect he's quietly a bit chuffed to be a figure of hope for billions of people all over the world.
He didn't choose to say something incredibly self-deprecating and humble.
I don't think he's got it in him, Fee.
No. Jane,